Welcome to Quora Anonymous. If this is your first time and you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you would like to read along, turn on closed captioning with the 3 dots in the upper right corner. Now, let's begin. What's a rule your employer implemented that backfired terribly? Earn $10 for every complaint. Years ago, when I first moved to Pennsylvania, I worked for an apartment rental company named Summit. I had a manager named Debbie, who was a complete idiot. Summit was a good company. They paid well and really cared about the residents. At their properties, I was the maintenance supervisor. The customer was always right, and we were expected to do whatever it took to keep them satisfied. We would have a monthly conference with our head office, and on one of the calls, it was mentioned that we had the lowest number of work orders called in out of the whole portfolio. I was pretty proud to hear that. I like to stay on top of preventive maintenance, go over our turns with a fine-toothed comb, and when something was repaired, I did it right the first time, in order to avoid callbacks. The time I saved by doing my job right the first time was spent painting apartments in-house to save the company money, working on curb appeal, and being proactive to fix the small things that could turn into big things later. I took the call as a huge compliment, but Debbie saw it differently. She thought that it meant we weren't working hard enough and not getting enough done, basically, slacking off. So she came up with a plan. That very day she wanted us to deliver flyers to everyone's door. The next week was going to be Customer Appreciation Week. Every morning would be breakfast on the run. That meant maintenance. All 2 of us would come in 2 hours early to hand out bagels, muffins, juice, and granola bars to residents as they left for work out by the front entrance. The next step in her grand plan was an incentive for the residents to call in more work orders. She offered a $10 rent credit for every work order they called in. Finally, there was going to be a huge customer appreciation party at the end of the week by the pool. Not a lot of people cared about the breakfast thing, most just waved and drove right by. The $10 credit for calling in a work order was very popular though. Everyone wanted in on that to the point where some people called in every single day, sometimes over and over again. It started out easy enough, air filters and light bulbs, maybe a running toilet here and there, mostly legit requests, just tons of them at once. Then, people started noticing gas smells, even though there was no gas in the apartments, at $10 a pop. Toilet seats were getting loose at an alarming pace. Blinds were breaking. Washing machines weren't cleaning properly, and dryers were too slow. Drip pans needed to be replaced, and cabinet doors were loose. We ran our *********** off that week. Every day was worse than the one before, and it was full speed ahead. Supply houses were delivering every day, and our shop was full of parts we were working overtime to replace. Debbie was in heaven. We went from 5 or 6 work orders a day to easily 100 or more. That had to be good, right? By the time Friday rolled around, and Customer Appreciation Week was finished, I was almost too tired to grill for the party. It was quite a blowout. Steak, shrimp, burgers, and hot dogs were served as well as beer, soda, and juice for the kids. Door prizes were handed out. It was the best party ever. It was a last party with Debbie though. By the time we had our next conference call, the bills started rolling in. Payroll was freaking out about all of the overtime. The rent credits were hitting the books. Thousands of dollars were totally wasted, but she was oblivious. I ended up staying for 15 more years, and went through 5 other genius managers. Every time you see a stupid rule, keep in mind that chances are that it came to be put there because of some rubbish done by some jerk at some earlier point in time. This now was a rule that was put in place for a good reason. But it had a very counterintuitive effect that an accountant would find hard to foresee, but any half-competent psychologist or economist would totally predict. At my management consulting firm in Boston where I worked at my first job out of uni, this was a small elite group of some just 40 to 50 consultants on one floor. In a tightly knit group like that, trust means everything. There is no bureaucracy to deal with, just one accountant, 2 graphics specialists, 2 IT guys, 4 admins and the rest all good old-fashioned professionals. You know, the way a business should be without all of the red tape, hours, and stuff. We did not have any stipulated limits on dinner expenses and cab services either. And it is much harder for people to self-justify cheating their own colleagues with whom they work and eat every day versus a faceless large corporation, though both instances are unethical. But just one stupid dishonest little shit changed all of that. The asshole started ordering over $50 worth of food, sometimes over $100. And he'd hang around just long enough to justify staying late, then promptly take all that food home. He even boasted openly about how he didn't need to buy any groceries, he just needed to order twice a week to take care of all meals. To give you some idea about the sleaziness of this fellow, he also started giving company cab vouchers to his friends outside of work and them using the vouchers over the weekend and them using the vouchers for rides even out of city limits, and, worst of all, pilfering those vouchers by fraudulently signing the name of my friend on those vouchers. He was fired promptly, as you'd expect. But the obnoxious habit of ordering enough food to feed a platoon of soldiers every evening did not break any specific rule per se. The partners just expected us to be decent and reasonable. Clearly they hadn't reckoned with a man of his kind. So the company then was forced to put a hard limit of $30 no more per person, per evening. This, for the record, was done before he got fired for his blatant fraudulent stealing of vouchers. You can well imagine what happened after the limits got put in place. Until then everyone ordered only as much as they needed to eat. And few meals went over $15 to $20. $30 is fairly generous, especially considering that this was a decade ago. But now, everyone started maximuming out their limits. It wasn't even as if they had been just itching to order more food before when there weren't even any limits. Hardly. Nobody was even annoyed as such by the rule. Why be when we generally ate well below that limit? But that $30 rule turned on some kind of subliminal mental switch. The funny thing is that they didn't start ordering the same amount, but from more expensive places. Nope, just much more quantities from the same places as before. If we had say 8 people who'd be working late, past 8 PM, one would come around taking the head count and saying, "Oh okay, we have $240. What would you like to have?" Then 15 minutes later, we still have $80 left. Want to order a third salad or 2 more pizzas or a second helping of that sushi platter? Hey, what the heck? Order it. If it's too much, we'll leave it in the fridge. It wasn't just the money being wasted. It was such monumental waste of food. Imagine how many of even the most artisanal pizzas and gourmet salads you can order for $200-300. Now then try and see if half a dozen of you can eat all of that without going into a food coma. Good God, the amount being ordered was so much you could have had a food fight, with plenty left over. I never ate at the office, no matter how late I had to work, unless it was going to be well past midnight, but I was the odd one out. I just think that dinner is something to be had in a relaxed fashion, not stuffing it down knowing that you must get back to work. That's totally fine for lunch. I generally ate on my way home, usually at the tavern right by my house. But I'd walk into the kitchen the next morning and see a ton of food in the fridge. That'd eventually get thrown out. It might seem like a small deal, just $10-15 more per person per evening. But given that you had 6 to 10 of us on average working late every evening, do the math. And you'll see how that adds up literally to tens of thousands of dollars extra per year. Once again, not some giant corporation. Just a floor of professionals. All of that waste. Because of the act of one classless shameless idiot. You know, we all like to complain about bureaucracy and rules this and rules that. How we'd like to work in a lightly regulated environment. But the sad thing is that often those rules are put in place necessitated by only a tiny minority that abuses the system in such an egregious fashion that there is no other option left but to put blanket rules in place for everyone. At such times you wish you could just say, "New rule." And this applies only to you three shats. Yes, we are talking only to you, and only about you. The rest are exempt as we know you're responsible and reasonable adults. Many years ago, I worked at a factory that did plastic and wax injection molding. The guy running the place had worked there since he was in his early 20s, so you'd think he'd have a good handle on how things were done. The problem with his leadership was that he had come up through the ranks as a salesman. He spent little to no time actually doing engineering or production. He was a wonderful salesman and a couple times landed contracts that were a great boon to the company. The man had a gift. He could have sold manure to a cattle farmer. One of his biggest contracts was a government contract. We were going to be making parts for the US military. During wartime, these types of contracts are as good as they come. The type of high demand production runs that fill bank accounts. Workers were asked to work a minimum of 60 hours a week, with unlimited overtime pre-approved. Some of us younger workers were working 80+ hours a week, only going home during the work week to get some sleep, then coming right back at 5 AM. Bank. I was running a machine that made a part. We'll call it Widget X. Well, Widget X was a fairly large part that required a lengthy cool-down phase. You can't just inject molten wax into a mold and expect it to hold shape until it has properly cooled. We only had one machine that was large enough to make Widget X, so it ran 24/7. A few months into the production run, management was in a bit of a panic. Widget X was one of the most important parts of the contract and we were falling behind on production schedule. Engineering and quality control were asked to find a way to speed up production, but they told management the biggest time sink was in the cooling phase. There just wasn't any way around that. If they lowered the temperature of the wax, it would be too thick upon injection and break the fragile ceramic cores in the mold. If they actively cooled the dye, the wax would solidify unevenly and cause warping. Mr. Leader, despite the fact that he had oversold our production capabilities, insisted that there was a way to increase output to meet demand. So he began looking into each and every step of the process. Back to me running the machine. As I said, there was a very lengthy cool-down phase where the machine remained locked shut until the part was ready. During this phase, I took a little time to pick a new CD to listen to while working. I said this was many years ago. Seeing me dicking around with my Discman, Mr. Leader went into a fit of rage. No wonder we are so far behind schedule. That's it. No more listening to music while working. We need to get back on track and I don't want to see another set of headphones in this place until we do. If you've never done it before, injection molding has to be one of the most boring jobs on the planet. You press the two start buttons, wait for the machine to close, do its thing, then wait some more until the part is ready. You remove the part, push the buttons again, and wait. That's the whole job. Music was one of the few things that made the job bearable. We could disappear into our own heads and only surface every few minutes to restart the process. Now that we couldn't do that, the boredom was up in our face. Staring at a giant metal press for 5 to 15 minutes at a time was dull. Very dull. So, we had to find ways to amuse our minds for that time. Being the social creatures that we are, we turned to our neighbors and began talking to each other. The problem is that machine shops are really noisy. In order to have a conversation that is not at a scream, we'd often have to take a few steps toward our neighbor. This, as you could imagine, meant that the machine operator's attention was not focused on the machine they were running, but on their conversations. Then when the machine was done running, they'd take a few seconds to finish their sentence and walk back to their machines. Production slowed. In cases like the machine I was running, not by much. However, some of the smaller parts only had 30, 60-second run times. An additional 10 seconds per part added up very quickly. Now parts that were running on time were running behind. 2 weeks into the new rule, the owner of the company paid our department a visit. This almost never happened. He was always in his office on the phone, or out on business. He had found out that every single part we were working on had fallen behind and wanted to know why. Mr. Leader had fed him a line that he didn't buy for a second and was going to figure it out himself. Luckily, the owner of the company understood production because he had done it early in his career. He knew how boring the job was and that asking employees to sit and stare while doing nothing was cruel. He rescinded the no music policy immediately and production resumed at a normal pace. He also then called one of his friends in the business and subcontracted some of the production of Widget X to him. In the end, nothing changed about how fast we could produce Widget X, but at least the rest of the contracts were back on schedule and we could listen to music again. How about getting paid more for not showing up to work at all? I used to work as a suit salesman in a large retail store. The pay was basically minimum wage, but you could make commission which effectively doubled your wage. My employer brought in a new rule around productivity. You now had to hit an ambitious average sales target for each hour you worked to qualify to receive any commission. Hit the target and you would get commission on all sales you made, miss it and you just get your basic pay. Crucially, there was no exemptions for time spent working at quiet times or time spent working in the stock rooms, prepping for sales, or doing anything other than actively selling. The result of this was that, if you wanted to earn commission, it was suicidal to do anything other than work the busiest shifts. You could sell loads one day, but spend a few hours in the stockroom selling nothing, and your average sales per hour would collapse. We had part-timers working only Saturday and Sunday who were earning more than the full-timers who were working 5 days a week, because it was so much easier to hit your targets on the weekend. If you were close to hitting your commission targets, you would obviously do literally anything to avoid doing anything which was not selling. I used to come into work half an hour early to tidy, but had I continued to do so it would have pushed me out of my commission target and cost me thousands, so clearly that stopped. Most of my colleagues suddenly requested to switch to part-time, weekend contracts for "personal reasons", and some were granted before management caught on to what was happening. If you were called in to cover a shift, your answer would depend entirely on how busy the shift was likely to be. We would be falling over ourselves to work a Saturday, but working a Tuesday could literally cost us significant money. Once, a manager strong-armed me into working a weekday which I knew would be a dead zone. I explained that working this shift would literally cost me £1,500, but he wouldn't budge. I ended up agreeing to work the shift, only if he agreed not to pay me for it, as that way I would preserve my productivity average and still get my commission. Then the sickness started. Say you were just within your "productivity bracket" for the month, and in line to receive commission, but had a week of slow shifts coming up. You knew for a fact that, if you came into work you would slip out of the bracket, but call in sick and your productivity is preserved, so there was a perverse financial incentive for not coming to work at all. It was a crazy system which resulted in far fewer sales overall, a hugely disorganized department, a massive blow to staff morale and a divisive angry atmosphere between those who made commission and those who didn't, despite often working longer and harder. I was lucky enough to be a part-timer, so I made out okay, but I left soon afterwards as it was obvious the place was being run by idiots. I worked for a newspaper in the 80s as a mainframe computer programmer. One day it was announced that the company was spinning off its computer functions to another shell company because the owner wanted to get his prize software running on Apple IE computers. Everyone was moved to a new location, except me and my secretary. I was told I was too valuable an asset to move. Whether that was code for "you suck" or not, I don't think so. But I can tell you that I was really the only one running the computer operations as well as most of the programming, because everyone was in love with this new Apple technology, including me, and had been foisting their work on me to allow them more time to play. Instead of making me the boss, they put me under the auspices of an accountant who thought he was Joe Computer Dude because he could do spreadsheets. My office overlooked a bar that all the computer guys frequented pretty much every night. One night I received a call at the bar saying that the computers were down. In the old mainframe days, this happened a lot. I walked back, fixed the problem, then went back to the bar. The next day, my new boss called me in and raked me over the coals about drinking on the job. I tried to explain that the daily runs would not happen had I not come back, especially since I was the only one in the department. He told me that under no circumstances was I allowed back in the building after I had been drinking. Cool, okay, whatever. As you might guess, a couple of days later, someone from the shop called me at the bar and said the computers were down. I told them they had to call Bill, not his real name, and he would have to fix it. I gave them his private home number. The phone rang a few minutes later with Bill apologizing for the error in his ways and asking me to go back and fix it for him. Then about a month later, we had some weird glitch that kept resetting the mainframe. I spent the whole night babysitting the hunk of iron and kept everything running. I knew my secretary was arriving in about an hour, so I tossed my coat on the floor and took a little nap. When she arrived, I told her what had happened and that I was going home to shower and get some breakfast. When I arrived around 10 AM, Bill called me into his office and screamed at me, telling me the office hours are 9 to 5, no exceptions, and I was expected to be at my desk promptly at 9. I explained what happened, but he didn't care and kept yelling. That night, I went home and unplugged my phone from the wall. I walked in my office at 8:59 and Bill was waiting there for me, screaming about how he has needed me since 7:30 AM. I regurgitated his words about 9-5, no exceptions to his face. He blanched and said, "Okay, we should reconsider what I said." He did these stupid things a lot, but I always found a loophole to show him the error of his ways. By the way, this guy was a horrible boss. When I got married on a Friday afternoon, he denied my vacation day at the last minute. I just walked out and got married. When my son was born, the hospital called and said I needed to pick him and my wife up and bring them home. I told him I was leaving. He was informed that it would be any day, but he said that I couldn't. They would have to find another way home. I looked him in the eyes and told him he would have to fire me and walked out. I didn't last much longer after that. A rule. I'm gonna be very liberal with my interpretation of rule. Back in 1999, I worked for Progressive Insurance. We were all required to work Super Bowl Sunday. They had purchased a massive Super Bowl advertisement and I think a bunch of halftime stuff. I, hating football with a passion, didn't mind working, and I think we got overtime pay. At any rate, the big spot came and went. We all worked cause some idiot at the top of the company thought that the commercial would prompt a tidal wave of insurance callers in the middle of the fucking Super Bowl. Like, "Hey guys who all came to my party to eat and drink and be merry, keep it down a secretary while I get an insurance quote." Who doesn't do that? The calls never happened. And I mean, this was a huge event. We had catered food. The entire call center, corner of Curry Road, North Scottsdale in Tempe, Arizona, was there. Hundreds of people. We were all making overtime. The place was festooned with what must have been thousands of dollars in decorations. This says nothing about the call centers in Cleveland and Tampa, which were way bigger. Nada. Not even an uptick in calls. What was precious was watching our VP, who flew out to our call center, watching the board to see the incoming calls. The look on his face was schadenfreudelicious. Excitement turned to anticipation to slight concern to bigger concern to full-on red fucking faced panic. The angry shouts. The freakouts. The other executives who sprinted from the floor, chasing after him. It was fun. Look. I'm not a genius. But I'm not stupid. I've run into this kind of problem twice in my life, when I saw from a mile away, and with absolutely no doubt, that the idea was horrible. The other one was a massive float/booth purchase by my local Costco wholesale at a town fair in the expectation that people would, while schlepping around with their bratty kids on a hot humid day, buy a $55 membership. Nope. There was laughter followed by pod managers freaking out, telling them not to laugh, because we all know that it's important to protect idiotic executive egos from plebs laughing at them. Millions spent on bullshit. Once upon a time, there was an auto repair shop. They had about 6 bays and a good average turnaround rate. They were doing pretty well. One day when the new manager was walking around, however, he noticed something shocking. There was a guy reading a magazine. He wasn't working on a car or helping customers. He was just sitting behind a counter, eating up profits with his hourly rate. He knew full well who this guy was. This was the parts guy. When the mechanics needed a part, an oil filter, a water pump, brake pads, etc., they'd go to the parts counter and request it. The parts guy would retrieve it from the shelves and give it to them. If the part didn't work out, they'd give it back to him and ask for a different one. If they didn't have the requisite part, he'd order it. He'd also order commonly used parts when they started getting low. He kept the parts shelves nice and tidy. But here he was in the middle of the workday, just sitting there. How often was he just sitting there? The new manager determined to find out. So, over the course of the next week, the manager tracked how much time the parts guy worked, and how much time he just spent sitting around, chomping away at profits. He determined that 80% of the time, the parts guy did no work. He just sat there, reading a magazine or other material. Profitless. So he fired the parts guy, and told the mechanics that now they were in charge of getting their own parts. There was some moaning and groaning, but they complied. What else could they do? Over the next month, the manager noticed a frightening trend. Their average turnaround time went up, way up. A repair that normally took a few hours now took a few days. A simple oil change went from less than an hour to half a day. Hell, even doing a simple tire plug could take half a day. And they were gasp losing customers. He determined to find the root of the plummet in productivity. To make a long story short, it was the missing parts guy. When the mechanics got their own parts, they'd grab them off the shelf and try them in their repair. If they didn't work out, or they grabbed too many, they'd just put them back any which way. They didn't always put them back in the right place, or in the right box. So that made it harder for them to even find the stuff they needed. Nothing was in order anymore. Plus, no one ever ordered anything, so they were always out of what they needed. They'd order it when they needed it, instead of beforehand. Then they had to wait for parts delivery to get them the stuff they needed, which could take half a day. So, instead of eating away at profits, the guy who only worked 20% of his time allowed the rest of the staff to be more productive. His absence actually killed profits by a wide margin. He was hired back. And they lived happily ever after. This was years ago, at my current employer. We're a mail house. We take people's mail, commingle it, sort it, and get a better rate from the post office. As we've grown, we've added inserting / fulfillment, and eventually, printing as well. Like a print shop, but built in reverse. I was hired to be the print department, which I did for 7 years, before I became the ad manager. As print designer, programmer, and general operator, I often had to talk with clients sending proofs, getting information, etc., and I developed a good rapport with many, if not all, of them, sometimes better than the salesperson they were assigned to. If there was something wrong with an order, I was often the first person they'd contact. So it was with a large client of the banking world. They were a high maintenance / high return client, so I always gave them my best customer service. This day, they called to find out about envelopes, which is not my department, but I knew whom to talk with, and I told them I'd look into it. I ran around the shop and got the info and reported back they were out of envelopes. Oops. I had neglected to loop the salesperson in on the request. They don't have any production knowledge, usually, so never was an issue in the past, but our salesperson, for some reason I'm still not clear on, had lied to the client and told them we had envelopes in stock. No envelopes meant that their time-sensitive prints weren't going on time. So when I said, yeah, there's no envelopes in stock, you'd better believe that our client went into panic mode. And of course, they called the salesperson back, who, not knowing that I had told them the truth, proceeded to lie again. The client was displeased, told them what I told them, and demanded an explanation. There was much backpedaling and psing from the salesperson along the lines of, "Oh, they'll be delivered today, Toby just didn't know blah blah." My manager, the general manager, the sales manager, all called me in. "Why are you talking with clients at all?" they asked, incensed. I could tell that they were this close to just firing me on the spot. Because I have daily conversations with them about their jobs? I offered. Not anymore. All communication goes through the salesperson. Okay, but just to make sure I understand this correctly, it was the salesperson that lied to the customer, right? That doesn't matter. You could have cost us this account. Veins were popping on at least 2 foreheads. No, I'm pretty sure that does matter. If we'd been honest with them, there wouldn't be a problem. And that was the 3rd forehead. They talked among themselves for a moment and said, just no more talking with clients. Your call. The next day, one of the client's vice presidents flew in from across the country for a surprise inspection. There were no envelopes. Because I was just a print jockey, I didn't have to be in that room when those 4 people got chewed out. But I did hear from the client that they were glad at least one person in the company was honest, or they'd have had a huge legal fight that they would lose on their hands. Yeah, we lost the account. And, yeah, relations with that salesperson and I were chilly from then on. Months later, she left the company. But what hurt even more was that all those customers who were used to my excellent customer service were now getting the runaround from their clueless salespeople. Several of them complained, and accounts were shuffled around, but eventually the people in charge figured out that the problem started when they took me out of the loop. "Toby, it's okay if you talk to clients again." Oh, good. Just check with the salespeople before you report on production, will you? You mean, in case we need to lie to them, *UNCOMFORTABLEFIDGETING in case we need to apologize. Okay. Because I'm not going to lie to our clients. That will be all. I'm happy to report that in the dozen or so years since, our sales team has become far more adept at apologizing and rectifying situations, and our production team has learned how to order before we run out of stock. My work here is done. Yes, a few clients did even suggest that they'd rather have me as their salesperson, but that idea was rejected by everyone. I don't do sales, for reasons obvious from this answer. If you made it this far, you owe it to yourself to subscribe.